Thank you very much. I currently serve with OM. I work with John Sonelia, who's our manager, and I also have a colleague, Brian Miller, who's working in Asia. But it's my privilege to speak with you today. Just a little bit of background. OM was founded in 1957, or can trace its roots back to 1957, which now makes it 65 years old. Now, I've never been 65 myself, but I have seen my parents pass through this milestone. At my cousin's wedding a few years ago, my parents impressed everyone there with the way they danced to a 1960s music. And it was apparent, however, that the intervening years from the 1960s had affected their agility, if not their ambition, in dancing on the dance floor. So much like them, OM has picked up a few things over the years which perhaps hold us back from moving forward. So I'd like to talk a bit about those today. OM began with a mission trip to Mexico, and the story goes that our founders, or one of our founders, George Verwer, sold the wedding cake from his marriage or his wedding to his wonderfully patient wife, Drina, so that they could buy fuel to get to Mexico. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole of OM's history in great detail, but over the years, OM has grown to over 5,500 workers in over 100 countries. And along the way, we've had 4 ships and are about to launch a 5th. This series of ships were obviously not funded from the sale of wedding cake, but through a combination of change in a fundraising approach and the corresponding move of the Holy Spirit in the hearts of our donors. We are now on our 3rd international director. So they never stand in line for photographs, but we have Peter Maiden, who's no longer with us, unfortunately. George Verwer in the middle, who's our founder, I've mentioned him. And currently we have Lawrence Tong, who came in to be our international director in 2013. When he came in, he initiated a global planning process, and the aim was to prepare the organization for the future, while also taking with us the right principles from the past. To achieve this, we set about listening to the leaders from 11 other organizations that we viewed as similar to ourselves. And we learned that we shared a lot in common with them, and that each of the organizations had their own unique challenges. Out of this process, this global planning process, we had task forces, which were broken off into groups of specialists. My involvement began, I was working in Africa at the time, when I was invited to be part of a financial generosity task force. We had corresponding task forces for mobilization, branding, church planting, and a couple of others. We all worked under OM's newly adopted vision statement that we want to see vibrant communities of Jesus followers amongst the least reached. And this had come out of months of distilling what values and outcomes lay at the core of what we're doing. At the time, and I think even now, it was about 450 ministries across the world in 110 countries. And those are just the ones that are recorded on our internal Caleb system. So when I say fields in OM terms, this roughly equates to countries or territories. So the financial development task force that we had, we met 4 or 5 times in person because COVID hadn't been invented. And for 3 days, 4 days at a time, we had guest experts from outside the organization to give us some of their wisdom from what they've picked up. And also we married that with a lot of the wisdom and just helping interpret OM. So we got the best of both worlds. Winding the clock forward very quickly, we began work in 2019 to implement the findings of the Financial Generosity Task Force. Like I said, this work is being led now by John Sonelia, and he'd been brought in specifically for this purpose. He was previously working for Habitat for Humanity and also worked with the Boys and Girls Clubs of America. Now, one of our values in OM is to be a very inclusive organization, raising up local leaders and to drive the work in their own fields. instead of relying on Western leaders to lead local workforces. And because of this mindset, we had, with the best of intentions, trying to do all things in all fields, we had a very egalitarian approach. And this had to be, which is very worthwhile in a lot of areas, but this had to be disrupted when it came to generosity, so that we could focus on a few of the key markets where we saw the greatest headroom or potential for generosity. So our aim was always return on investment, which sounds terribly unspiritual compared to the previous speakers, but this is, I'm getting into the mechanics of it. Going back a little bit, we started this process with, in 2018, we carried out an internal self-assessment survey amongst about 15 of our fields, so that we could determine which ones were ready and which ones weren't ready for a major change, major shift in their fundraising thinking. Some of the factors we looked at were whether the leaders had been in place for less than a year, what they thought was a major gift, and whether they had any fundraising staff, dedicated fundraising staff. And in this, we also unearthed a few unhealthy perspectives on fundraising, which we would look to challenge in the years to come. Taking our learning from this internal assessment, we moved to a smaller number of fields and carried out market research into the markets that we were looking to focus on. So we carried out a market depth study, and I was fortunate enough to be joined by an intern who was doing an MBA at the time. And this one great outcome of using an intern was that he had to run what we were doing past his professors. So we got professor level inputs for the cost of an intern. So that's very advisable if anyone's considering how they can carry out such a survey with very little money. So this market depth to see market research, we looked at over 4,300 data points to determine which markets we would focus on. These included things like number of Protestant believers, the GDP, the global giving index rankings, and we even considered things like currency volatility and economic outlook, all information which is readily available. To use our terminology, we referred to all of our fields at this stage as pre-focus, with a view to elevating 3 of them to focus field status. And the pre-focus fields, it was always our intention that would have a view into what was taking place in the focus fields, so that they could pick up best practices and be inspired from the focus fields as they themselves were being readied for future investment, future engagement. Our focus was on major gifts, specifically face-to-face partnerships for both new prospects and for retaining existing relationships. This personal approach, again, it's one of our values in OM. Our mission methodology is connecting with least reached people groups around the world on a one-to-one basis. And so this was a good face-to-face major gifts was a good fit for our organization culture. As well as the self-assessment and the market depth study, we also had a conversation phase to help capture factors which the first 2 weren't really designed to. So we could speak into a lot of the softer issues. We then selected our major or our key focus fields, which were the UK, Germany, and we took a regional approach in Southeast Asia. Asia was very important to us because of the presence of the ships, and now having a global leader from the region, we had pre-existing relationships and a CEO with a cultural capital necessary to maximize those relationships in Southeast Asia. As I mentioned, OM's in 110 countries, been going for 65 years, so we're quite complicated around the world. There's no two fields that are alike, and so we've built some culture or rules which we have to find creative ways of navigating. One such issue was that we wanted to have a signed MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with all of our focus fields. However, one field in particular required that any MOU must be signed by the Board of Trustees. And we met this barrier by changing the name of the document from MOU to Partnership Agreement, so that we could get through that administrative hurdle. Sometimes you have to be creative to make progress, and our goal of reaching the least reach was always at the forefront of our thinking. And the time saved and keeping a healthy line between the executive and the governance components of the organisation, we felt that this was a justified tweak in our documentation. Also, we found that a lot of our fields, through our self-assessment, they lacked a written fundraising plan. So going back to our task force meetings, we looked at the guiding strategies for fundraising. I won't go through these in great details, but as I've mentioned, we had 450 projects that we were trying to explain to donors, and that gets very time consuming. So we boiled it down to 4 key mission funding priorities that we would discuss with them. We also had a case for support. We hadn't had a global case for support before, which might shock a lot of you. But yes, we went about writing that. And obviously we've done the typical fundraising campaign things like feasibility study, changing our people and culture, and things like lead gifts and revenue diversity, and working on our operational excellence. Let me go through this. So what we've learned through this process, and again, if anyone's got any questions, I'm very happy to answer them. If you want to see any of the tools we built through this process, I'm very happy to share them so that you don't have to duplicate anything yourselves. I think the biggest thing for us is challenging the status quo. We talk about, from discipleship. We had to disciple our leaders quite a lot in generosity. And so when we, for example, we have a field where they have restrictions because of the past, and with the best intentions, one of our fields has restrictions on how much, or rules around how much they can pay staff. And this comes from a historic concern for the well-being of people. What they've said is that they limit what the highest paid person can be paid to 1.5 times what the lowest person can be paid. Now that is a great idea, but it doesn't explain how we lift someone from the lowest position or lowest income bracket to the highest. So for example, if someone's earning 20,000 in whatever currency, the highest that anyone could be paid is capped at 30,000. Now, it doesn't actually, like I said, it doesn't do anything to help the person on the lowest amount. And finding the experienced fundraisers that we needed for our major gifts fundraising was difficult, was challenging, because to pay them a market rate, a competitive salary, meant that we would have to go above our 1.5 limit in a few fields. So if you ask any of our ministry leaders what they need in the coming year or 5 years, or even right now, I'm sure you're familiar with this, you'll usually hear 2 things. One is more people, and the other one is more money. And so by not being able to hire a major gifts officer, we were actually not providing more money, and ended up not being able to fully support the people that we did have already. So we had to change that mindset and challenge that status quo. Another learning from our campaign so far is that throughout the life of the organisation, we have picked up donors who have a very fixed image of what they see the organisation as and what it's doing. And if their vision doesn't mature or doesn't develop as the organization does, then there is a temptation amongst those who manage those relationships to halt progress, to halt development in the organization out of a deference for the feelings of those donors. So we have to make some tough decisions, or have, again, it's a discipleship issue, bringing our donors along with us. And just finally, it's all about the people. You can't do things without the people. And I've been working on this for 4 years, and we've seen a lot of changes in people. People who were hesitant at first or didn't understand, just really flourishing. And like Ruthie said in the introduction there, that's what I really find joy in, is seeing people unlocking a passion that has been in them for generosity and helping others in generosity. And change of people as well. We have in OM, we have term limits for our field leaders. So you can serve up to 2 4-year terms, which meant that some of the fields that we were looking at as pre-focus fields, they actually changed. The leaders changed in those. And 1 or 2 of the focus or pre-focus fields that we'd worked with, because of the change in leadership, are now actually much more better poised. And we're seeing amazing things happening there as well. So yeah. And the change in people, we, like I say, we launched in the OM in the UK and in Germany very early on, and then we were a little bit behind in Southeast Asia. There were a few things changing there, but actually, incredibly, my colleague Brian Miller, who is working in Southeast Asia, he kept coming to me and saying, you know, oh, I've got to learn from you. I've got to catch up with you guys. And amazingly, they've now leapfrogged where we are in the UK and in Germany. And I'm very pleased to say, we've hired our first major gifts officer recently in Southeast Asia. And just finally, to close out on this, pioneer investors, these people are crucial. Our angel investment people, they really demonstrate to people within our organization, they help with that mindset change. This is what people outside our organization believe we should be doing. This is what people outside of our organization are prepared to invest in. And having designated funds for running a growth in your generosity ministry within your organization is transformational. So I can't thank our angel investors, our pioneer investors enough, because that gives us a real platform with which to go out and develop. That's it from me. I'm very happy to take questions either through this Q&A session or through, you can contact me personally.